Hi friends, Miss Onesi here. Welcome back for week 6 of distance learning. Before we get started with our lesson today, I just wanted to share something, a card that my sister actually sent me in the mail. It's got this cute little fox on the front and it says, "You should be proud of yourself." So I just wanted to share that sentiment because I think it's important to remember in these times when things might seem a little harder than they usually are, when we're not in school to see all of each other. You should still be proud of yourself and all the work that you're doing. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with our lesson this week. If you're in the right spot, you're going to be looking at the front page. It's going to be page 202, and it says Lesson 13, Unfamiliar Words. So make sure you have that page ready and you have a pencil all ready to go. Okay, so this is what our page is going to look like right here. Okay, so today we're going to be, for this lesson, we're going to be reading an informational text. Actually, we're going to be reading a few informational texts about science and engineering topics. And we're going to be using context clues, something called context clues, to figure out the meanings of unfamiliar words. Okay, so when you look inside of a word, you look at all of its parts, right? We might look at the prefix or the suffix to try to figure out what it means. When you look beyond a word, you might search for its meaning in a dictionary or in other kinds of resources. And when you look outside of a word, when you look at what comes before and after the word, you're looking at all those surrounding words, phrases, and sentences. Those are all known as context clues. And we're going to be figuring out how to use context clues to figure out the meaning of words in our readings today. And this is going to be especially helpful when we're reading things in our subject areas like math and science and social studies, right? Because there's going to be lots of unfamiliar words that we might not know. So let's focus our attention on our learning target for today. Let's read this together with me. It says, using context clues to figure out the meaning of unfamiliar words and phrases will deepen your understanding of the text that you read. Okay, let's go ahead and read that next section together as well. It says, informational texts often have words people don't use in everyday life. Some words usually appear only in texts in one subject area. For example, you'll see the word fossil in science texts and the word geography in social studies texts, but you're really not going to see them many other places, right? Other words called academic words are useful in many subject areas. For example, the academic word process often appears in both science and social studies texts. As you read, you can use context clues to figure out the meanings of unfamiliar words and phrases. Clues might be synonyms, antonyms, examples, or definitions. So we're going to go ahead and read this passage below, and we're going to circle the phrase conceived of and underline context clues that will help you understand its meaning. So let's go ahead and read this together and see if we can figure out what conceived of means in this context. So it says inventing the crane. Before we start reading, we can also see that there's an image there of a crane, right? That might also help us understand what conceived of means. Let's go read this together. Ancient Greek engineers thought of ways to make new machines from older ones. For example, they conceived of and built a compound machine called the crane. Their idea combined with the lever, pulley, and wheel and axle into one machine. Okay, so I'm going to underline some words or phrases around conceived of that might help me figure out the meaning. So the ancient Greeks thought of some ways to make these new machines. For example, they conceived of and built a compound machine called the crane. Their idea combined the lever, pulley, and wheel axle into one machine. Okay, so those kind of make me, those kind of context clues make me try to think about what that word conceived of means. So let's look at the next page, page 203, and let's use this chart to help us organize our thinking. Okay, so the first box says helpful context. Okay, so some of the helpful parts of this that are going to help us figure out our new word, or our word that we're not sure of the meaning of yet. Okay, so I listed here in our helpful context, I have 1, ancient Greek engineers thought of ways to make new machines. And the clue that I'm getting from that phrase right there is that they thought of ways, right? Because When we're talking about this word conceive, we know that the word conceived, that's going to be a verb, how it's used, because the ancient Greeks did this thing, right? The ancient Greeks conceived of something. So we know it has to be something that they did. And if this is telling me the ancient Greek engineers thought of ways, then maybe that could give me an idea of what that word conceived was. If they thought of ways to make new machines, maybe they conceived new machines, right? And then in this another helpful context, the clue I'm getting from here is that word idea, right? They had some kind of idea to combine these things into one machine. So what's the possible meaning of what this word conceived is as it's used in the passage? So I can kind of see now, using these clues, that the word conceived might mean that the ancient Greeks came up with an idea, right? They thought of different ways, they came up with some kind of idea, okay? So what is the meaning of this phrase? So right here we can write that conceived of means thought of or came up with something, like an idea or an invention. Okay, so you can go ahead and pause the screen and copy that into your packets. So in this next section, we're going to be reading a science text, and we're going to practice using context clues to determine the meanings of unfamiliar words and phrases. So figuring out word meanings, that's going to help us to better understand the information that the author is giving us in the text. So let's go ahead and look at this text a little bit. We see that it's titled Fire and Air. So I think we're going to be learning a little bit about how fire and air kind of work with each other. But not only do we have a title in this one, we also have this thing right here called, here, let me see if I can underline it for you, called a heading, right? We have an extra little subtitle here, right? It's underneath our original title. So an experiment with fire. Ooh, so we know that this reading is actually going to include a section about an experiment. I want you guys to go ahead and read this text independently. And as you're reading it, make sure you are circling any unfamiliar words or phrases. And then while you're circling them, kind of look around the word and underline any words or phrases that might give you clues to the meaning of that word. Okay? So go ahead and pause the video and read this page independently. All right, so now that we finished reading that story, I'm just going to ask you a few quick rapid fire questions to make sure we understood. Okay, so first question. What do you need to start a fire? I'll give you a hint. There's 3 things you need. So the 3 things you need to start a fire are fuel, you need some kind of heat, and you also need oxygen. Okay, question number 2. How can you make a fire stronger? What can you do to make a fire stronger? Well, to make a fire stronger, right, you can add more of one of those 3 things you need to start one. So you can add more fuel, you can add more heat, or you can add more oxygen. Okay, third and final question. What is this science text mostly about? So we know this science text is mostly about understanding the relationship between fire and oxygen. So let's go on to page 205 here, and let's read this explore question together. It says, how did context clues help you figure out the meaning of unfamiliar words in the science text? Now let's look at this graphic organizer here. This is going to help organize our thinking. It says, complete the chart below, write the helpful context and clues you used to figure out the meaning of each unfamiliar word. Okay, so the first word that they want us to figure out here is combust. Okay, so I'm going to go back into the text to find that word first. Let's go back and see the word combust. Okay, so it's right at the beginning of the text. It's in that second sentence. So I'm going to actually circle this word combust. Let me get my little tool out here. I'm going to circle this word combust. Okay. Then I'm going to underline details near the word that's going to help me understand what the word means in that context. So one bit of information is actually in that first sentence, and it's already written in the chart for us, but let me underline it here. It says, starting a fire is a bit like following a recipe. Okay. I also see a second piece of helpful information in the third sentence. It says, all three are needed for burning to begin. So I'm actually going to go ahead and write that in the chart below. So we can go ahead and write that second piece of helpful context that I found. It says, all three are needed for burning to begin. Okay, so go ahead and copy that. Now I want to identify the clues that I got from these little bits of helpful context. So I'm going to use short phrases or maybe even just a single word in this clues box. For number one, I'm going to start and I'm going to write something short that I get from that first. I'm going to say starting a fire. Okay, and for number two, I'm going to write burning. Okay, so when I think about these two clues together, starting a fire and burning, I can figure out what combust might mean, right? I think that when I think about those two things, I think that combust means to catch on fire. So I'm going to write that in the possible meaning right here. I think it means to catch on fire. Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and write that up here where it says combust means to catch on fire. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for our second word, monitor. So I found they actually gave us two pieces of helpful context for the word monitor, but I actually found two more that I'm going to add. So let's go ahead and find that word in the text first. So monitor is actually over here in our experiment with fire section. So if we want to know how to do this experiment with fire, we need to know what the word monitor means. So let's go see if we can find any helpful context around the word monitor to see what that word means. And I see here, pay attention to the candles. So right before the word monitor, it's telling us to pay attention to the candles to monitor. That's a helpful piece of context. And to watch what happens over time, to monitor what happens over time. Then I have, you will observe that, okay, and also keep watching. Okay, I've got so many clues here that are going to help me figure out the meaning of this word monitor. So I'm going to go ahead and put those in my chart. Okay, so I put in my helpful context over here, and now just like up here, I'm going to pull a word or phrase from each of them to kind of break it down and see what clues I can gather from each of these pieces of the text. So the first one, it says, pay attention to the candles. The first clue that I pulled out was attention, right? The second one, I'm going to pull out the phrase happens over time. For this third one, I'm going to pull out that word observe. And for this last one, I'm going to pull out the word watching. Now I know what watching means. I know what observe means. So when you have to pay attention to something and observe what happens over time, well, I think the meaning, possible meaning of the word monitor is to kind of watch it, right? To kind of keep an eye on it. So I'm going to write that here. I think monitor means to watch or to keep an eye on something. And then I'll go ahead and write it up here as well. To watch or to keep an eye on. So I can see from that practice that finding out a word's meaning by using context clues, it's not a guessing game, right? We really have to look at the context. We have to look at those phrases kind of before and after it, or those sentences, and we have to look really closely at those specific clues within those phrases or sentences to come up with a realistic definition for the word. And remember, doing this, being able to figure out the meaning of these words that we don't know is going to help us understand what kind of information the author is trying to give to us. That's going to be all the guided practice for this week, but keep reading in the packet. There's so many interesting pieces of text in this week's packet about engineering, building, science, all really interesting stuff. And of course, if you have any questions or any concerns, you can always feel free to call me, text me, or email me, and I'll be happy to help. Okay, love you guys. See you next week. Bye.